In this next part, which is module 3.2, we're going to introduce ourselves once again to the Philippine systems that have existed in our past with some more details like timelines and key processes behind each system. So, how has Philippine political life been organized through time given the theory that we just unpacked? Well, we already saw this, but we have chiefdoms, we have sultanates, colonial systems, and the Philippine nation state. So let's describe these, right? So under module 4, we're going to talk about the early forms of Philippine political organization and identity as primarily community based. So politics at this time, although there were alliances and everything like that, most of the time the political system existed in a very small space, or it wasn't even really always a space. It was instead smaller systems that are based on kinship networks between pinuno or leader and dolohan or following. So these have different terms: bayan, barangay, banwa, ili. So from more stable to less stable systems, you find these political rules existing on community levels. So here we will explore the relationships within and beyond our first political units. So topics include primary sources where primary and secondary sources where we learn about early chiefdoms. We're going to look at basis of early socio-political complexity, types of societies, and how they engaged with the wider Southeast Asian world. So, after we look at I okay, so let's describe this a little more, no? The possible periodizations or when these systems existed as the dominant form of organization was between 500 BC to 1565. And I'll be explaining those periodizations later, but some notable dates according to um, scholars who've studied the early period in Philippine settlements indicate 500 BC, well, BCE. This is from Yonker, who will be really learning about more later. And Yonker argues that 500 BC sees to the emergence of our first socio-politically complex communities. So we'll define what that is later. But basically, these are societies with more identifiable hierarchies between who is an elite, who is ruled, and who is the ruler. Diba? Another interesting sub period, I guess, is the period from 900 BCE, 900 CE, so Common Era, to 1400, which is still pre-colonial, right? And this has been tagged by historians like Anthony Reid as the Southeast Asian Age of Commerce. And who was in Southeast Asia at the time? We were in Southeast Asia at the time. So how did we connect to that network? So we'll talk about trading routes that were dominant here and how these affected the politics of alliances within the Philippines, right? So why do we have to look at the chiefdom and its many configurations, right? Whether that's a bayan, barangay, etc., etc. Well, because these are the oldest units of politicization in the Philippines. So these are the mechanisms through which people experienced politics. Mostly because you're forced to. When you're born into a particular barangay and you automatically are a slave in that barangay due to your heritage, that's a political relationship. It's a relationship of power that you have to experience because you're compelled to serve labor to a particular leader, diba? So, besides that being our oldest unit of politicization or the experience of politics, this is also the primary access point to wider political systems like policies, resources, beliefs about politics in almost all periods of Philippine history. So even after 1565, our basic community levels, whether that's the barangay in the present day or even the barangay in the colonial period, diba? Kasi we had the cabeza de barangay. So that was the head of a barangay, meaning there's one that existed even under Spain. So these are the first points through which we experience policies, resources, and beliefs about politics that come from the wider system. So, before the digital age, much of what we learned about politics was based from our community experiences. What kinds of taxes were imposed? What kinds of leadership was built into the system, diba? Is it a cabeza de barangay who rules you or who tries to extract resources, tries to protect you, etc., etc.? Where are you conscripted? Where are you? Paano ba to? What is the mechanism through which you are compelled to serve mandatory service under the repartimiento, diba? The polo y servicio. Usually, it's in barangay units where they were counting the census, right? For who could serve under the military or who could be compelled to serve labor. So, many other things, right? Many other things, which we'll be talking about later on. Pero that's the value of the chiefdom, both in its own period, diba? And also in periods that would follow. Yun yung long-lasting effect niya. Key points. So we argue that these are the early forms of organization and political identity were community centric. There was no wider political organization during this time. There could be alliances, but those were not always stable. And so most of the rules of the game would come from your own society and your own political culture. Allegiance was not always territorial, but instead familial or based on barangay kinship networks. So it's possible na kung tatanungin mo in the in the early period of the chiefdoms, um, you wouldn't say nasaan ang barangay ng ano ba yung mga ng Lakandula, 'di ba? Asan yung barangay ng Lakandula? You wouldn't really ask about physical space, although people did tend to live together when they could. You would ask, sino ang barangay ni Lakandula? Who are the followers of this datu? So they could be found geographically in one coastal village, but there could be other followers as far inland as they could get because they still pledged allegiance to the leader. So pledging allegiance means if there's a war or a fight, you will run to their aid. It means you'll share resources and you probably have family within that network. Diba? We'll talk about it more later. Finally, there were alliances, and this tended to shift the tide in favor of one area or another, especially when there were larger events like the entry of Spanish colonization. We'll see to that later. Okay, so the next module, the next module, module 5, will be tackling the sultanates, right? So, how do we describe the sultanates? Beginning in 1450, the early Philippines witnessed the development of a form of system where politics was formally organized based on more than just a barangay or community based scale. These were the first instances of larger scale political development. The introduction of Islam to the islands in the 13th century and the subsequent growth of the sultanates represent a historical narrative that would develop alongside the Spanish Philippine colony when it was established in 1565. Here, we explore the boundaries of the sultanates as political systems in and of themselves, with their own political economy and their own political culture and their own alliances within Southeast Asia. So the topics here include primary and secondary sources to introduce you to the very rich and interesting world of sultanates. And also, there will be specific sub-modules tackling the Sulu Sultanate and the Maguindanao Sultanate. There are actually more, like the Lanao one and then the 13 smaller ones from the late Spanish period, but they were really small and they didn't last as long as these two, which is why these are the focus of our study. So let's describe the sultanates a little more. Why do we have to study them? Well, is it 1450 or 1405? Okay, when we get to the module on the sultanates, I'll fix the periodization. I think it's 1405 pala, not 1450. Yeah. Anyway, so the dominant period is from 1405 to the mid-19th century when they were defeated by the Spanish. So, iba actually yung timeline ng Sulu at yung Maguindanao. Pero, if you look at their history together, by the mid-19th century, due to internal tension within sultanates plus the introduction of new technology on the side of the Spanish, such as light armed steamboats, which could now attack territories in the Sulu area. They were defeated, they captured the leaders, and they they signed treaties where the sultanates could still kind of do their own politics, but they were now protectorates of Spain. So dun silang dahan-dahan na na-absorb into what would become the Philippines. Anyway, notable dates include in 1405, we find the beginning of the Sultanate of Sulu. By the mid 17th century, we have the beginning of the Sultanate of Maguindanao. As I said, different timelines. And from the 17th century, which is the 1660s, to the 18th century, you have the Moro-Spanish Wars, which are interesting because, just as a brief note here, and hopefully to pique your interest, you remember repartimiento, polo y servicio, right? What were the polo or forms of labor that people had to serve? Agricultural work, galleon trade building, and there was a peak in the 1660s specifically because they had to serve as soldiers in both the Moro Spanish Wars and the Dutch Wars. So Filipinos, Indios from the Philippines were actually really big participants in the struggle over power in Southeast Asia, not only between local political systems such as the sultanates, but also new entrants onto the international stage like the Dutch. So we'll talk about that then. Anyway, so what is the significance of sultanates to our political tradition? Well, the sultanates represent one of the main lines of historical divergence in the formation of Philippine political systems. As I said, mainstream Philippine culture tends to be the Hispanized Philippine culture, right? But a large area of the Philippines was not Hispanized. They were Hispanized as late as 1850 onwards, diba? So it's not really enough to deeply affect your culture. So these two historical lines of divergence are both part of what we call the Philippine political tradition. Especially the further south you move, their historical narratives will shift towards the experiences of those poles of power. So these narratives are foundational in our what is the long standing value of the Sultanate's history? Well, these narratives are foundational in the present day understanding of the spectrum of claims in Mindanao from autonomous regions to secessionism. So, in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a large movement by armed groups in Mindanao that they wanted to claim a part of the Philippines as a different country, as a separate nation state. And we'll kind of get to see how part of that argument was historical, but at the same time, the tension that existed within this period was also a product of historical processes. So we're gonna actually study the sultanates in a way twice. Once during the sultanate period, and we'll have brief notes on it during the module on Philippine upheavals. Yan. So key points that we're gonna argue for. One, the Islamic system became an important base of organization and political culture. Two, the scope of our history of sultanates developed largely within a certain geographic zone called the Sulu Zone, an alternative scale of place for interpreting Philippine history. So, yung naiisip natin now na Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, right, ending in the Tawi-Tawi archipelago to the very south, is not actually the whole space for where Philippine history has taken place. Because if we look at maps related to the Sulu Zone, the Maguindanao and Sulu Sultanate actually operated within a larger network where they had allies and even different political system. Parang their rules applied in different places. Therefore, those parts of the world were in their political system, like Sabah, which is part of Borneo in the present. Don't worry, we'll talk about it when we get there. So after we talk about sultanates, we're gonna delve into the interesting world of colonial systems. Now, the colonial systems introduced institutions that would be fundamental to the formation of the Philippine state later on. We talked about this briefly before in the way we conceptualize territory and in the way we look at what institutions are important for our state. Parang there are a lot of influences by our colonial histories in these areas. So, for instance, the importance of the Catholic Church in swaying policies, the public educational system introduced by the Americans, as well as the institutions of elite democracy, our basic settlement pattern in the majority of the lowland coastal Philippines, and so on, are some instances of the lasting impact of the colonial periods on our political life today. So, once again, we'll look at primary and secondary sources that argue for how the Philippines was organized during these times. And then we're going to branch out into a submodule on the Spanish colony and a submodule on the American colony. So, will this be a repetition of what we learned in History 1? No, actually. A lot of the stuff we covered in History 1 won't be discussed here. Instead, we'll be looking at the structures of politics during this time and how Filipinos were convinced to follow those structures of rule, right? Okay, so the dominant period, of course, possible periodizations include 1565 to 1946, which encompasses both Spanish and American colonial rule. Notable dates, of course, are Spanish colonial rule, the Philippine Revolution, which is the interlude between Spanish and American rule, and of course the American colonial period. So why is this period significant? We've already discussed or read that out loud earlier. So let's jump to the key points that we will be arguing for. The colonial period served to structure both our sense of wider political identity beyond I okay, sorry. The colonial period served to structure our sense of wider political identity beyond our immediate settlements. Why is it that the Philippine Revolution claimed or received participation from people in Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao? Why isn't it Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, Taiwan, the Spice Islands, and Sabah? Diba? Because Spain claimed a certain territorial scope, and the experiences under that territorial scope helped us imagine what the scope of the Philippines was. So, yun yung mga titignan natin. Like, how was our sense of identity bounded by experiences? We're not saying that the Spanish created the Filipino identity, right? But it was one of the limitations which we had to work with. So despite the introduction of a Philippine revolutionary political system, this did not have the chance to influence our political tradition as much because, as you can see, for the large swath of time between 1565 to 1946, it was colonial systems that organized our politics. Okay, so after all of this, we'll move into the third part of the course, which tackles the Philippine democratic state tradition. So, some of the topics that, or the periodization that we're going to follow and we're going to try to pick apart is this, right? So there's an overlap actually from the colonial period or colonial system and the Philippine democratic state tradition. So we'll discuss American state building and how it reshaped our networks of elite control. So, dito natin makikita yung initial growth of elite democracy with strong locally based political machinery and the emergence of a two-party system. We'll also see some notes from the period of Philippine independence from 1946 to 1972, where we had a special relationship with the United States. We're going to try to tackle the politics of development, dirty politics, and the way presidents during the time tried to direct the way we were organized and how the overall political system was responding to wider events in Southeast Asia and the world. So after that, we'll also try to look at authoritarian experimentation, which is, of course, the first major experiment in changing what the Americans introduced as a political system. No? So we were still called the Philippine Republic, but now we could have potentially transformed the political system then if we really became a presidential parliamentary system with a completely different way of managing our resources. So we'll discuss briefly discuss authoritarian democracy, parliamentary government, and crony capitalism. So, of course, the period after 1986 represents supposedly the period of free democratization, where we have a multi-party system and there's a trend of social reform. But there are so many problems associated with post dictatorial reorganization. And we'll try to look at the tendencies of this period and how more and more people were able to participate in politics to a certain extent. So yeah, that's it for our lecture for today. Uh, iba pala yung organization ng lecture ko before this, and I forgot to remove the other parts, no? But let's try to go back to what we discussed here. So, remember that in this lecture, we tried to bridge historiography and political systems theory by introducing why we should study the political system and how we describe the political system. So we looked at the modified political systems theory or framework that I constructed for this class, and we tried to look for its conceptual origins in the Western political science tradition. So after we described the traditional political system, I showed you which parts I modified in order to bridge well with historical analysis. And then once we kind of understood what the political system is and what the modified political system is, we jumped to an overview of political systems where we tried to define the four political systems that we're going to study a little more. We looked at the periodizations, descriptions, potential topics, and even key arguments to be made under Module 4, Chiefdom, Bayan, Barangay. Yan. Module 5, Sultanates. Module 6, Colonial Systems. And Modules 7 to 9, where we tackle the democratic state tradition. Ayun. So that's it for today's lecture. Please don't forget to fill out Learning Guide 2 and answer the discussion board or contribute to the discussion board. So the discussion board is going to be a place for you to ask questions or even share analysis on what you've learned from the entirety of part 2 of the course, where we explore Philippine political systems before the nation state. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in our next lecture. Bye-bye.